The sun has always been both a source of life and a force of destruction. It gives warmth, makes crops grow, and marks the passage of time. Civilizations throughout history have depended on its rising and feared its setting. But to many ancient cultures, the sun was more than a celestial body. It was a god, and gods demand offerings. Before men built temples of stone, before kings wore crowns of gold, before the first symbols were carved into clay tablets, there was the sun. It was the first god. The earliest humans, looking up at the sky, saw a force far greater than themselves. It dictated the seasons, determined the success of hunts, and decided whether food would be plentiful or scarce. It was a ruler, an entity beyond comprehension, a power that could give life or take it away. In its presence, they flourished. In its absence, they starved. The cycle of night and day, of summer and winter, became more than a natural rhythm. It became a sacred law. And from this law, the first myths of the sun god were born. The oldest known civilizations left behind carvings, paintings, and stories depicting the sun as both a life-giver and a force of destruction. In ancient Egypt, the sun was worshipped as Ra, the supreme god who sailed across the sky in his golden barge, bringing light to the world. But Ra was not immortal. Every night he was swallowed into the underworld and had to fight against the forces of chaos to be reborn at dawn. In Hindu mythology, the sun god Surya was a divine being who brought warmth and health, but also one whose wrath could scorch the earth and turn rivers to dust. In Norse legend, the sun was chased across the sky by a giant wolf, destined to be devoured when the world reached its final days. But while these cultures respected and feared the sun, others worshipped it in blood and fire. As human societies grew more complex, their rituals became more elaborate. Priests and shamans, those who claimed to speak with the gods, developed ways to communicate with the sun. But what do you offer a god who controls all life? It was not enough to give fruits or grain. The sun was greater than these things. It needed something more valuable. It needed life itself. The logic was simple. The sun gives life. The sun takes life. To keep it strong, life must be returned to it. And so, sacrifices began. Some civilizations believed that a few drops of blood were enough to satisfy the sun. Others thought that entire lives had to be given. And some, like the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Phoenicians, built entire empires of sacrifice, where thousands were slaughtered in the hope that the sun would remain strong. But their devotion came at a terrible cost, because once the gods have tasted blood, they always demand more. The city of Tenochtitlan rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco, a masterpiece of human ingenuity. It was a city of floating gardens, golden temples, and vast markets filled with the wealth of an empire. But at its heart stood something far more ominous, the Templo Mayor, the great pyramid where the Aztecs honored their most powerful god, HUITZILOPOCHTLI, the sun and war god. For the Aztecs, the sun was not a gentle deity. It was not simply a source of warmth or a guardian of crops. It was a warrior, locked in an eternal battle against darkness. Every day, as the sun moved across the sky, it was fighting to keep the universe alive. And like all warriors, it needed strength to continue the fight. That strength came from blood. HUITZILOPOCHTLI was a god with an insatiable hunger. If he was not fed, if his thirst for sacrifice was not met, he would lose his battle. The sun would grow weak, and the world would end in darkness. The Aztecs saw it as their divine duty to ensure that never happened. The Templo Mayor towered over the city, a stairway of death leading to the heavens. It was built with one purpose in mind, to bring men closer to the sun so that their blood could reach the gods faster. At its summit, priests gathered dressed in robes soaked in dried blood, their bodies painted with sacred symbols. In their hands they carried obsidian knives, blades so sharp they could slice through flesh as easily as a whisper through the wind. The sacrificial victims, usually captured warriors from enemy tribes, were led up the steps in a slow, methodical procession. Their fate had been decided long before their capture. They were not prisoners of war. They were fuel for the sun. Upon reaching the top of the pyramid, the victims were laid upon a great stone slab, their arms and legs held down by the attending priests. The high priest, standing above them, lifted his knife high into the air, murmuring prayers to HUITZILOPOCHTLI. The blade plunged into the chest. The priest's hands, quick and practiced, tore through skin, muscle and bone, reaching into the cavity to grasp the still beating heart. With a final brutal motion, he ripped it free. The heart, steaming in the cool morning air, was held toward the sky, its last pulses sending rivulets of blood streaming down the priest's forearm. The sun had been fed, and the body of the sacrifice was rolled down the steps of the pyramid, bouncing and tumbling, leaving a trail of crimson in its wake. But a single sacrifice was never enough. The Aztecs believed that every day was a battle for the sun. Every sunrise was a victory, but every sunset was a warning. The darkness was always waiting, hungry, patient, ready to consume the world if the blood stopped flowing. To prevent that, the sacrifices had to continue. The most infamous of these rituals occurred in the year 1487, during the dedication of the newly rebuilt Templo Mayor. The ceremony was meant to celebrate the power of the Aztec Empire, and to prove its devotion to HUITZILOPOCHTLI. But the gods did not ask for songs or feasts, they asked for blood. For 4 days, an assembly of high priests carried out a mass execution on a scale never before seen. One by one, thousands of captives were led up the pyramid, their bodies offered to the sky. The city below was drenched in the smell of blood, and the steps of the temple ran red with the lifeblood of the fallen. Some historical estimates suggest that as many as 20,000 people were sacrificed in that single ceremony. The sheer volume of death turned the temple into a river of blood, its steps so slick that priests and victims alike struggled to find footing. The bodies, once emptied of their life essence, were cast down the pyramid, their remains gathered in piles at its base. Some would be flayed, their skins worn by priests as ceremonial robes. Others would be dismembered, their flesh cooked and consumed in sacred feasts, a gruesome reminder that to the Aztecs, sacrifice was not a choice. It was a necessity. Unlike many civilizations that sacrificed only in times of crisis, the Aztecs waged war specifically to capture sacrifices. These conflicts, known as the Flower Wars, were fought not for territory, not for wealth, but to ensure a steady supply of victims for the altars of HUITZILOPOCHTLI. Young warriors were trained not to kill, but to wound and subdue. The greatest honor was not to slay an enemy, but to drag him back to Tenochtitlan, where his heart could be offered to the sun. The Flower Wars were ritualistic, never-ending, a cycle that mirrored the very nature of the sun itself, rising, setting, rising again, sustained only by sacrifice. For over 2 centuries, the Aztecs upheld their duty to keep the sun alive through death. But in 1519, a new force arrived, one that would bring the blood ritual to an abrupt and violent end. When Hernán Cortés and his Spanish conquistadors arrived in Tenochtitlan, they were horrified by what they saw. To the Catholic Spaniards, the Aztecs were not warriors or priests, they were butchers, their gods nothing more than demons that demanded an endless tide of slaughter. Armed with steel weapons and horses, the Spaniards brought war to the Aztecs, cutting down their warriors and destroying their temples. The great city fell in 1521, and with it, the reign of HUITZILOPOCHTLI came to an end. The Templo Mayor was reduced to ruins, its blood-stained stones left to crumble. The Spanish priests erected churches on the temple's remains, replacing the warrior sun god with the image of a crucified Christ. The sacrifices stopped. The sun, however, continued to rise. But for the Aztecs, the world had already ended. The mighty Inca Empire ruled over vast stretches of South America, stretching from modern-day Colombia to Chile. They built their cities high in the Andes, carved temples from stone, and constructed vast road networks that connected their empire. But above all else, they worshipped Inti, the sun god, the divine ruler who gave them warmth, guided their crops, and sustained their world. The Inca, like the Aztecs, believed that the sun was a force that had to be maintained through devotion. But unlike the bloody, battlefield-style sacrifices of their Mesoamerican counterparts, the Inca did not take prisoners of war to be slain on stone altars. Their sacrifices were more selective, more ceremonial, more haunting. For the Inca, the most powerful offering that could be given to the sun god was not that of warriors or criminals, but of children. This practice, known as capacocha, was a deeply spiritual and solemn ritual. Children who were chosen for sacrifice were not picked at random, nor were they taken by force. Instead, they were selected from the noblest families, often described as being the most perfect in appearance, unblemished and beautiful. To the Inca, these children were not victims, they were messengers, chosen to ascend to the highest peaks of the Andes, where the air was thin and the world felt closest to the heavens. They were believed to become divine themselves, transcending death and joining Inti in the afterlife, where they would serve as his attendants for eternity. This was not considered a punishment. It was the greatest honor an Inca child could receive. Once a child was chosen, the ritual preparations began. The families of the sacrificed children saw their selection as a moment of great prestige, as they had been handpicked to present their most precious gift to the gods. The child was dressed in the finest garments, adorned with gold, silver, and sacred textiles, woven by the most skilled artisans in the empire. Priests purified them through ritual baths, anointing their skin with sacred oils and preparing them for their final journey. Then a procession began. Priests, nobles, and warriors would accompany the child on a pilgrimage through the empire, sometimes lasting for weeks or even months. Along the way, festivals and ceremonies were held in their honor. Food and gifts were offered. Prayers were whispered. The people believed that by witnessing the child's sacrifice, they too could be blessed by the sun god. At last, they reached their final destination, the mountaintops. It was there, at altitudes of over 20,000 feet, where the sacrifice would take place. Unlike the brutal sacrifices of the Aztecs, the Inca sacrifices were eerily peaceful. The children were given a final meal: maize, dried meats, and chicha, a fermented corn beer. They were wrapped in fine cloth, adorned with jewelry, and seated in the fetal position, facing the rising sun. Then, the method of sacrifice varied. Some were given a strong dose of coca leaves, a plant that acted as a sedative, numbing their senses as they drifted into a sleep from which they would never awaken. Others were strangled with ceremonial cords, their breath taken as an offering to the gods. Some, in more brutal cases, were struck on the head with a club, their skulls caved in with a single blow, and then they were left. High above the world, atop the frozen peaks of the Andes, their bodies were not buried but placed in stone tombs, meant to remain untouched for eternity. Unlike most human remains, which decay with time, the extreme cold of the mountains preserved them almost perfectly. Centuries later, when modern archaeologists began discovering these frozen sacrifices, they were stunned by what they found. The children's bodies were intact, their skin, hair, and clothing as pristine as the day they had died. Their faces remained frozen in time, expressions calm, almost serene, as if they had simply fallen asleep on the mountain. Among the most famous of these discoveries was La Doncella, or the Maiden, a 15-year-old Inca girl whose body was found perfectly preserved in the volcanic mountains of Argentina. Her hair was still braided, her skin unblemished, her lips slightly parted, as if she had simply drifted into an eternal dream. Forensic analysis revealed that in her final hours, she had consumed chicha and coca leaves, likely to ease her passage into death. But perhaps the most haunting detail was this: she had been placed facing the east, toward the rising sun. Her soul, the Inca believed, was now one with Inti. To the modern world, the idea of ritually sacrificing children is among the most disturbing practices in human history. But to the Inca, capacocha was not murder. It was an act of devotion, a way to maintain balance between the gods and the empire. The reasons for these sacrifices varied. Some were carried out in times of drought or famine to appease the sun and ensure agricultural prosperity. Others were performed to mark the ascension of a new emperor as a way to seek divine favor. It was believed that without these offerings, the world itself would suffer. If the sun god was displeased, the mountains could shake, the crops could wither, the rivers could dry, and the empire could collapse. So the sacrifices continued. But in the 16th century, everything changed. In 1532, Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro arrived in the Inca Empire, bringing war, disease, and destruction. Within a few years, the Spanish, armed with superior weapons and European illnesses, toppled the greatest civilization of South America. The rituals of Capacocha ended. The sun god's mountain children were forgotten, their resting places left untouched for centuries, but the mountains never released their secrets. And when modern explorers uncovered their tombs, the children of the sun were still there, waiting, frozen in time, untouched by the world that had long since forgotten them. The bodies of these sacrificed children remain among the most haunting relics of ancient sun worship. Unlike the blood-soaked altars of the Aztecs, which were reduced to rubble, the Inca sacrifices were never destroyed. They still sit, high in the Andes, perfectly preserved in their icy tombs, as if watching the modern world from the past. And with them remains a lingering question. Was their sacrifice truly necessary? To the Inca, the answer was simple. The sun had to be fed, and in return, it would keep its fire burning forever. The sun has always been worshipped as a giver of life, warmth, and abundance. But to the Phoenicians, the sun was not merely a provider, it was a force that demanded sacrifice. Unlike the Aztecs, who tore hearts from warriors, or the Incas, who left their chosen children to freeze atop mountains, the Phoenicians and Carthaginians believed that the most powerful offering to the sun was fire itself. And the most sacred fuel for that fire was the blood of their own children. In the cities of Tyre, Sidon, and later Carthage, great temples were built in honor of Baal and Moloch, gods of fire, the sun, and destruction. These gods were not merciful, nor were they content with mere prayers. They were ancient beings of hunger and rage, celestial forces who could bring either prosperity or ruin, and whose favor could only be won through blood and flame. Their followers believed that by offering the lives of their own children, they could ensure victory in war, protection from famine, and the continued favor of the burning god in the sky. Baal and Moloch were often seen as two faces of the same entity, a sun deity whose worship stretched across the Near East and the Mediterranean world. The Babylonians, Canaanites, and Phoenicians all revered him, though by different names. Baal was depicted as a majestic figure with a crown of flames, a god of storms, war, and fertility, who controlled both the life-giving rains and the searing heat of the sun. He was honored with grand festivals and sacrifices, but his hunger was nothing compared to that of Moloch. Moloch was a far more terrifying figure, a bronze idol with the head of a bull, massive and imposing, his arms outstretched to receive offerings. His altars were not places of prayer, but of fire and death. His followers believed that to satisfy the sun god's insatiable appetite, the most valuable offering had to be given, newborn children and infants, their purity making them the ultimate sacrifice. The Tophet, an open-air sanctuary devoted to Moloch, was the place where human offerings were made. These sacred spaces were found in Carthage, Phoenicia, and other regions influenced by the cult of Baal and Moloch. Families seeking divine favor would bring their own children to the temple, believing that by offering their firstborn, they could secure prosperity and protection for the rest of their household. The ceremony was a horrific spectacle, performed on massive holy days dedicated to the sun. Priests, draped in ceremonial robes, led the grieving parents through a series of chants and prayers. They assured them that their sacrifice was not a loss, but an act of divine exchange, an offering that would be rewarded with wealth, fertility, and victory in battle. Then came the moment of sacrifice. The bronze idol of Moloch was prepared, its arms outstretched, and a great fire was kindled within its hollowed chest. The flames were stoked until the statue itself glowed red-hot, radiating unbearable heat. One by one, the infants were placed onto the burning hands of the idol, their bodies igniting instantly. The fire consumed them, their cries drowned out by the beating of drums and the wails of the priests, who raised their arms toward the sky in reverence. The smoke, thick and acrid, rose into the heavens, carrying the children's souls to the gods. The people believed they had done their duty. The sacrifice had been made, the gods were fed, and Moloch, they prayed, would be satisfied. For centuries, historians debated whether these stories of child sacrifice were exaggerated. Roman propaganda meant to demonize the Carthaginians, but then evidence was unearthed. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of ancient Carthage discovered a site known as the Tophet of Salambo, a massive burial ground filled with thousands of urns containing the charred remains of infants and young children. Many of the urns bore inscriptions dedicating the sacrifices to Baal-Hamon and Tanit, gods associated with fire, the sun, and fertility. Some of the children had been only weeks old when they were offered to the flames. Others were as old as 6 or 7, their bodies burned and buried with tokens of divine favor. This discovery confirmed what many had feared. The worship of Moloch was real, and the sacrifice of children had been practiced on an industrial scale. To the modern world, the act of burning children alive in the name of a god is unthinkable. But to the ancient Phoenicians and Carthaginians, this was not an act of cruelty, but of necessity. They believed that the gods required something of great value in order to protect the people. They thought that by offering the life of a single child, they could ensure the survival of thousands. War, famine, and disease were constant threats. A bad harvest could mean the deaths of an entire city. If the gods were not pleased, the sun could scorch the land, the rains could fail, the enemies of Carthage could triumph. When the Romans destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, they sought to wipe out the cult of Moloch forever. The Tophets were abandoned, the temples razed to the ground. But whispers of his worship never truly disappeared. Some believed that secret cults carried on the rituals, hiding their practices from the outside world. References to Moloch appear in Jewish and Christian texts, always associated with dark and forbidden rites. Even in modern times, his name is evoked in discussions of hidden sacrifices, elite rituals, and forbidden knowledge. Moloch, it is said, never truly died. He simply went underground, waiting for the day when his flames would rise again. The worship of Moloch was one of the most extreme examples of human sacrifice to the sun, but it was far from the only one. From India to Mesopotamia, civilizations carried out ritual burnings, believing that fire was the bridge between the mortal world and the gods. Fire was seen as purification, transformation, and divine consumption. For thousands of years, it was believed that if the sun gave its fire to mankind, then mankind must return the fire to the sun. But some ancient civilizations saw the sun not just as a giver, but as a destroyer. They feared that one day the sun itself might turn against them, unleashing its full wrath upon the world. And so, they sought ways to control it, worship it, and appease it. To the ancient Egyptians, Ra was the origin of all things. He was said to have risen from the primordial waters, bringing light and order to the universe. Every day he sailed across the sky in his celestial barge, and every night he descended into the underworld where he battled the serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos. If Ra ever failed in his fight, if Apophis ever swallowed him whole, then the sun would not rise, and the world would be plunged into eternal darkness. Ra was often depicted as a man with the head of a falcon, crowned with a solar disk encircled by a cobra, symbolizing his divine power. His followers believed that without his light, all life would wither and die. Because of this, Egyptian priests built great temples in his honor, ensuring that Ra was worshipped properly, so that he would continue to shine upon the land. But not all Egyptians were content with simply honoring Ra. One man, one pharaoh, believed that Ra alone was not enough. He believed that the sun itself was the true god, and in his quest to make the sun the center of all worship, he nearly destroyed Egypt itself. In the 14th century BCE, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV ascended the throne of Egypt. At first, he followed the religious traditions of his ancestors, paying tribute to the many gods of the Egyptian pantheon. But as his reign progressed, he began to reject the old ways. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning servant of Aten. Then he did the unthinkable. He declared that all other gods were false, and that only Aten, the sun disk, was worthy of worship. This was unprecedented in Egyptian history. The Egyptians had always been polytheistic, honoring countless deities, each with their own domains and temples. But Akhenaten sought to erase them all. He ordered the names of other gods to be chiseled out of temple walls. Statues of Amun, Osiris, and Ptah were destroyed. The powerful priests of Egypt, who had controlled religious life for centuries, suddenly found themselves stripped of power. And at the center of Akhenaten's vision stood Aten, the sun itself. To fully dedicate himself to Aten, Akhenaten abandoned Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt. He ordered the construction of a new city, one that would be devoted entirely to sun worship. This city was called Akhetaten, or Horizon of Aten, and it was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. Temples to Aten were built without roofs, so that the rays of the sun could shine directly onto the altars. Akhenaten and his wife, Queen Nefertiti, were depicted not as gods themselves, but as the divine representatives of Aten, with the sun's rays reaching down to touch them. In his radical vision, Aten was not a human-like god, but an intangible, all-powerful force, a concept far closer to modern monotheism than to traditional Egyptian beliefs. Akhenaten believed that only through the sun could one achieve true enlightenment. He rejected the elaborate afterlife rituals that defined Egyptian religion, believing instead that Aten's light alone was enough to grant eternal life. But while Akhenaten saw himself as a visionary, his people saw him as a heretic. His revolution had angered the priests, destabilized the empire, and plunged Egypt into chaos. For nearly 17 years, Akhenaten ruled over Egypt, enforcing his solar monotheism with absolute authority. But after his death, his enemies struck back. His successors, including the famous Tutankhamun, abandoned his reforms and restored the traditional gods. Akhetaten was abandoned, left to crumble in the desert sands. The name of Akhenaten was erased from history, his statues defaced, his temples torn down. To the Egyptians, he was no longer a pharaoh. He was a blasphemer, a ruler who had betrayed the gods and nearly doomed the kingdom, and with his fall the worship of Aten faded into obscurity. But some believe that his vision never truly died. Though Akhenaten's reign was brief, some historians believe that his ideas influenced later religious movements, possibly even the foundations of Judaism and monotheism itself. His belief in a single, all-powerful deity was unlike anything else in the ancient world. Some esoteric traditions claim that the worship of Aten continued in secret, passed down through hidden brotherhoods, waiting for the day when the world would be ready for the truth. Even today, Akhenaten remains one of the most controversial figures in Egyptian history, a ruler who dared to replace the gods with the light of the sun, and who nearly destroyed an empire in the process. His failed revolution serves as a warning. The sun gives life, but it also destroys, and those who seek to control it may find themselves consumed by its fire. Across the rolling green hills, dense forests, and misty landscapes of ancient Europe, the Celts built vast stone circles and performed elaborate rituals to honor the forces of nature. They revered the land, the sky, the waters, but above all, they worshipped fire. To the Celts, fire was not just a tool for warmth and cooking. It was a divine force, a living presence that connected the mortal world with the supernatural. Fire was creation and destruction, light and death, and at the heart of their most sacred beliefs stood two powerful solar deities, LUGH and BELENUS, gods of fire, war, and the sun's eternal power. Their worship was unlike anything seen in the Near East or the Americas. The Celts did not simply sacrifice people on altars or burn children in temples. They set men ablaze in towering wooden effigies. They danced around great bonfires, calling upon the gods for protection and strength. They saw fire as the bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead, a force that could consume life but also purify the soul. And when the sun blazed too bright, when famine threatened their lands, or when war loomed on the horizon, the Celts knew what had to be done. Blood had to be fed to the flames. Among the many gods of the Celtic pantheon, few were as revered as LUGH. Known as LUGH of the Long Arm, he was a warrior, a king, and a god of fire and sunlight. He was not simply a sun god, he was a god of storms, destruction, and divine wisdom. In myth, he wielded a magical spear that could never miss its mark, a weapon that burned as bright as the sun itself. LUGH's power was honored in the great festival of LUGH, a time of harvest, sacrifice, and fire rituals dedicated to securing his favor. Every year, on the first day of August, the Celts celebrated LUGH by gathering in great numbers to light enormous bonfires, blazes that could be seen for miles, symbolizing the sun's strength. But these were not mere celebrations. LUGH was also a time of sacrifice. It was believed that without an offering, the sun's fire could grow weak. and the crops would fail. To prevent this, human and animal sacrifices were carried out, their blood feeding the earth, their souls ascending with the flames to the heavens, where LUGH would receive them. The sacrifices varied from simple offerings of livestock to far darker rituals, such as the burning of prisoners and criminals, a practice that some say was tied to the infamous Wicker Man. One of the most terrifying rituals attributed to the Celts was the Wicker Man sacrifice. In times of great crisis, failed harvests, disease, or impending war, it was believed that the gods required something greater than livestock or grain. They required human souls. The Druids, the Celtic priesthood, were said to construct massive wooden effigies, sometimes as tall as houses, in the shape of a man with outstretched arms. These towering structures, made of woven branches and reeds, served as both altar and pyre. Inside the Wicker Man, captives, criminals, and sometimes even willing sacrifices were placed, tied, bound, and awaiting their fate. As night fell, the Druids would chant their sacred incantations, raising their hands to the sky, calling upon LUGH and BELENUS, asking for their favor. Then the flames were set. The Wicker Man erupted into fire, engulfing everything inside. The people within screamed, their voices merging with the roaring of the flames, their flesh blackening, their bodies reduced to ash. To the Celts, this was not cruelty, it was an offering. They believed that the souls of the burned would rise with the smoke, carried into the realm of the gods, who would in turn bless the tribe with protection, victory, and prosperity. But LUGH was not the only god to whom the Celts made sacrificial offerings. For the Celts of Gaul and Britain, another sun deity was just as important, BELENUS, the Shining One. While LUGH was the warrior of the sun, BELENUS was its guardian and healer. He was often depicted as riding a chariot across the sky, his hair made of flames, his hands carrying the sacred fire that purified the land. His followers believed that fire was both destruction and renewal, a force that could devour but also heal, just as the sun burns but also nourishes life. The greatest festival dedicated to BELENUS was Beltane, held on May 1st, when massive bonfires were lit across the lands in his honor. The Celts believed that these sacred fires could drive away evil spirits, heal the sick, and cleanse the tribe of misfortune. But as with all fire rituals, sacrifices were needed. During Beltane, livestock and crops were often burned as offerings, but in times of drought, famine, or war, human sacrifices were made to strengthen the sun. Unlike the brutal Wicker Man sacrifices performed in honor of LUGH, the rites of BELENUS were more solemn and ritualistic. Victims, often prisoners, criminals, or slaves, were chosen by druidic divination. Some were bled out slowly, their blood gathered in bowls and poured onto sacred flames as an offering to BELENUS. Others were drowned in sacred wells, their bodies set ablaze afterward, sending both water and fire offerings to the gods. The Celts believed that by offering life to the flames, they ensured the continued favor of BELENUS, that the sun would shine, the crops would grow, and the land would remain fertile. But there was also a darker belief. Many Celts feared that one day the sun itself would turn against them, that it would burn too hot, scorch the fields, and bring ruin to the world. And so they fed the flames, hoping to control them. The Celts, unlike the Egyptians or the Inca, did not always see the sun as a benevolent force. They believed it could be merciful or vengeful, protective or wrathful. This belief was reflected in their fire sacrifices, in which the boundaries between gods and men blurred, where the living were consumed by flames, just as the sun consumes the sky. The sun was not only a giver of life, it was a force that demanded submission, worship, and sacrifice. And if the people failed to feed the flames, then the flames would one day consume them all. For millennia, cultures around the world worshipped the sun as a bringer of life, warmth, and divine power. It was the force that made crops grow, gave light to the world, and guided the cycles of existence. But not all myths saw the sun as an eternal benefactor. Some feared that one day the sun would turn against them. Ancient civilizations understood that while the sun gave life, it could also bring death. It could scorch the earth, wither crops, dry up rivers, and turn fertile lands into barren deserts. If angered, the sun could become a cosmic force of destruction, a weapon of the gods, an omen of the end of days. Across history, myths warned of a time when the sun would burn too brightly, punish mankind, or disappear entirely, plunging the world into chaos. Some of these stories were mere legends. Others may have been memories of real catastrophes, solar storms, droughts, and climate shifts that wiped out entire civilizations. And some perhaps are warnings of what is still to come. In many ancient traditions, the sun was not only a giver, it was a weapon. It was something to be feared, a force that could destroy just as easily as it could create. One of the oldest stories of the sun's wrath comes from Hindu mythology, where the god Surya, the sun god, was once considered too powerful for the world to handle. According to legend, Surya's heat became so unbearable that humans, gods, and even demons begged for relief. Eventually, the great god Vishnu cut Surya down to half his original size, reducing his power so that life on Earth could continue. But in many myths, the sun's destruction is not prevented. It comes in full force, bringing devastation. In Egyptian mythology, the sun god Ra was once angered by humanity's disobedience. In response, he sent his daughter Sekhmet, a lion-headed goddess of war and fire, to punish mankind. Sekhmet went on a rampage, slaughtering humans by the thousands, her breath turning the air into flames. The destruction was so great that even Ra himself grew frightened and tricked her into drinking blood-red beer, making her too drunk to continue the massacre. This story reflected the Egyptian fear of the sun's destructive power, a reminder that Ra's light could just as easily become a weapon of ruin. The Aztecs too believed in the inevitable destruction of the sun. According to their mythology, the universe had gone through 5 different suns, each one destroyed in a cataclysm. The current sun, the 5th sun, would one day be wiped out by earthquakes and fire, plunging the world into darkness forever. To delay this fate, the Aztecs believed they had to feed the sun with human blood, keeping it strong in the face of its eventual death. But even the most powerful sacrifices would not prevent the end. The sun, they believed, would eventually burn out or destroy everything in its path, leaving only silence and night in its wake. While these myths spoke of cosmic destruction, there is evidence that real disasters caused by the sun shaped ancient fears. The collapse of some of the world's greatest civilizations may have been linked to the sun's growing fury, whether through droughts, heat waves, or solar events. One of the most famous cases is the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the world's first recorded empire, around 2200 BCE. Archaeologists believe that a sudden climate shift, possibly caused by changes in the sun's activity, triggered a mega-drought that lasted for decades. Entire cities were abandoned, rivers dried up, starvation spread. The once great empire crumbled into dust, never to rise again. Similarly, the Mayan civilization, known for its towering pyramids and advanced astronomical knowledge, mysteriously collapsed around 900 CE. For years, scholars debated what caused its downfall, but recent studies suggest that a massive, prolonged drought, driven by shifts in solar radiation, may have been the final blow. Without rain, their cities became inhospitable wastelands. The people, unable to grow food, abandoned their homes. The great temples of the Mayan kings, once dedicated to the worship of the sun, were left to be swallowed by the jungle. To the Mayans, the sun had once been their greatest god. In the end, it may have been their executioner. While many ancient cultures feared the burning sun, others had an even greater fear. One of the most haunting myths of Norse mythology tells of Ragnarok, the end of the world. According to the prophecy, one of the first signs of the apocalypse will be the swallowing of the sun by a great wolf named Skoll. As the sun vanishes, darkness will spread across the world, ushering in an age of famine, war, and destruction. The Mayan prophecies also spoke of a time when the sun would go dark, signaling the end of their great cycle. Some interpreted these prophecies as predicting solar eclipses, while others believed they hinted at something even more ominous, a time when the sun itself would weaken, throwing the world into chaos and extinction. And in modern times, scientists have begun to explore whether ancient fears of solar destruction could have some basis in reality. For centuries, humans have depended on the stability of the sun. We assume that it will rise every morning and set every evening, just as it always has. But what if that assumption is wrong? Today we know that the sun is not a perfect, unchanging force. It is a raging ball of nuclear fire, constantly emitting solar flares, radiation, and charged particles. Scientists warn that a massive solar storm, like the Carrington event of 1859, which knocked out telegraph systems across the world, could one day cripple modern civilization, wiping out power grids, satellites, and communication networks. Others fear that, millions of years in the future, the sun will expand into a red giant, growing so large that it engulfs the Earth in flames, reducing it to a barren rock. If that happens, then the ancient fears of the sun's wrath will have been correct all along. The civilizations that once sacrificed humans to the sun may have been desperately trying to delay an inevitable fate, a fate that, one day, may come for us all. The worship of the sun, in all its terrifying glory, has shaped the course of human history. It has built empires and destroyed them, inspired both creation and sacrifice. And yet, even as the ancient rituals have faded, the fire of the sun god never truly went out. It lives on in secret traditions, in forgotten texts, in whispers of ancient knowledge passed down through the ages. Because not all solar gods demanded blood, some offered something far greater, not death, but immortality. And one god, above all others, promised his followers eternal life, divine wisdom, and a path to illumination. A god whose name has been whispered in the shadows of empires,